Jakob Sanderson is the owner of the Thinking About Thinking substack, and he's part of the Dynasty Points Podcast and ADP Chasing. He's a lawyer, a critical thinker, a Celtics fan, and he once appeared on a game show called Canada's Smartest Person. These are his late-round perspectives. This episode is sponsored by DraftKings. There's no better way to lock in your fantasy dominance early than with Best Ball on DraftKings, where you draft once and ride your roster all season long. And right now, DraftKings is giving all customers a can't-miss offer. Draft one, get one. Enter a lineup in the $15 million Best Ball contest for just $20, and you'll score another Best Ball ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million, giving you a second shot to win big. It's easy. Just draft your dream team once, no weekly management required, and let your top scorers automatically start each week. Across the whole season, every breakout star, every clutch play, every touchdown will count towards your quest for a share of $15 million. I'm drafting over there all the time. It's an absolute blast. So download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app now to draft your $20 Best Ball lineup to play for a share of $15 million and get a second ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million. That's two chances to win big without ever setting your lineup again. Draft one, get one, only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY to 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. One per customer. Enter the Best Ball $15 million headliner contest by 9/4/25 to get one bonus entry. $20 entry fee required. Reward expires in 30 days. See terms at DraftKings.com/NFL-best-ball. Sponsored by DK. Now back to the show. When I do perspectives, I like to research people a little bit. And I Googled you, and we got to talk about this game show. We got to. We're on this show called Canada's Smartest Person. Is this correct?
That's correct.
What was the show about?
I wouldn't take it too literally.
You got to give us the rundown of, like, I have never heard of this show in my life. I'm sure a lot of American listeners have not heard of this show. So what was this all about?
I'm not surprised that Americans are not constantly consuming Canadian game show content. But it ran for I think 3 years, and it was based on Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. So the idea was each episode there'd be 4 contestants, and you would do a challenge based on each component of intelligence. So there would be like physical intelligence, logical intelligence, analytical intelligence, artistic, etc., linguistic. So I was just watching hockey with my dad during the playoffs, and this commercial like kept coming up over and over again. CBC was just shoving this commercial down our throat, and it was like, apply. Dad was like, you should apply. Like you'd be interesting on TV. You're reasonably smart or whatever. So I was like, all right, you know what? Screw it. So I filled out a written application, and then they called me and we did like an interview, and then we had to do an intelligence test. And I guess I did good enough. So then, I flew out to Toronto and did not win. So I'm not Canada's Smartest Person. In my 4-person episode, I made it to the top 2, where we had to do a gauntlet, which combined all of the different elements of intelligence. Specifically, I got to the stage at about the same time with 2 left, and we had to carry foam blocks over a seesaw, and that was to test our physical intelligence. And I had insufficient physical intelligence. So I continued to drop the blocks over the seesaw. That was the end of the road for me.
Has this been pushed on like social and stuff to you, like in your mentions before?
I've seen it on occasion. There's like, right like at the moment that I lost, you can see like 2 things. One, you can like see me like throw the block on the ground after like falling off and like pretty clearly yelling the F word. And then like the other one is that like after like I've calmed down from that, I just kind of do like one of these.
Yeah.
And that has been like slowed down, and someone's like made a GIF of that. So it's just like a very slow motion version of me like doing I don't even know how you describe but doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I mean, look, I would say that I am not going to meme that at times this year, but I'm going to meme that at times this year because it's awesome. That's fantastic. But look, this is your first time on Perspectives. You did Becoming a Best Ball Bro last year. You and I have chatted for years now. You're one of my favorites in the space and the way that you think about stuff. So I'm really, really excited to sort of get into the game theory stuff that we both tend to gravitate towards and love. But I like to ask guests whenever they're first timers on the show, which has been basically every single guest on the show, what gravitated you towards fantasy football content and writing and doing this sick thing that all of us do?
I mean, I'm going to start really young on this. So this is like easily the most deranged thing about me. It actually came up on our Dynasty Points show this week as well. But when I was like 4, 5, 6, I started like operating entirely fake sports leagues, just like up here in the noggin, to the point where I would like I had fully made up names of every player on every team in the league. We had like uniforms, logos, backstories, like historical records, all this stuff. And I would just have it all written down in like a book. And then each day I would like decide the results of the games. I would log that, and then I would solo act out the day's results as like a highlight show on the Sanderson Sports Network. I was obviously an only child, so from that age, like it was clear, like I had like a truly deranged obsession with sports and with stats. So I feel like it was always kind of a matter of time. But the next major component was that my mom was like, "You're not playing football." And I was like, "Please?" She was like, "No, you'll get a concussion and you will die." And so I was just like obsessed with football, especially because it's like the thing I couldn't have. And so I would watch it all the time, think about it all the time. And then once I was introduced to the concept of fantasy football, which I think was like 14, I joined my first league like through work. I was immediately completely obsessive. So became a huge fan, started listening to all his podcasts, including this JJ guy, tried to get in on it, tried to learn more about it. And then, once I moved out to Vancouver for school, that's when Tom Tipple and you've been on our show, you met Tom, and he was like my real life friend. Like we played slow pitch together for 3 years before we ever did a podcast. And then we were like, hey, why don't I start a fantasy football podcast? Just like keep in touch when you move to Vancouver. And we did. And then, got on Twitter to promote the show and stuff. And things just kind of took off from there.
That's awesome. And it's good to have some Canadian blood in the streets. You know what I mean? There's just a lot of us obnoxious Americans out there. You're a lawyer also, like as your day job. So I'm curious, like how that has impacted the way that you look at fantasy football and do your fantasy football analysis. And I think like I don't want to make this sound like it's a negative thing. It comes out in your writing, like it comes out in your research, and that like you're incredibly detailed. You really want to think about things that other people aren't necessarily thinking about. And I would assume that stems from it could just be innately a part of you, and that's why you are a lawyer. But I'm assuming also like it stems from you being a lawyer.
Yeah, it's probably tough to do the chicken or the egg thing. I feel like you get pushed into two different things. One, I think it really helps in terms of the podcasting and the court stuff. Like I'm so much less nervous, I think, in court because I've been podcasting to a microphone for like 6 years.
Yeah, true.
That helps a lot. I think also in terms of like the amount of times that I started doing more collective bargaining work, is I work in labor law. The amount of times that I just think through collective bargaining in terms of a fantasy football trade is like daily.
That's hilarious. That's
Where
awesome.
I'm like, it's kind of the same idea. Like we're trying to align incentives. It's like, yeah, man, like you need a wide receiver and 2% wage increase in 2026.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know like whether I feel like being a lawyer helps more in the fantasy stuff or if it's vice versa. And I also just think naturally you have a certain personality, certain interests, you get drawn to similar things. I definitely do think like the sort of logical reasoning that is like drilled into your mind through law school in terms of just, if this, then that, if that, then this, definitely I think naturally just kind of affects how I try to think through, not just by writing, but also some of my takes, I guess. Like I constantly try to think in terms of like, well, what would be the most logical reason for this certain explanation? And if anything, that might even get me in trouble sometimes. And I've tried to do that a little bit less, because I think sometimes you see like the most easy or simplest explanation is most likely correct maybe in real life, and maybe less in fantasy football, where you sometimes wind up overfitting things. And so I've actually tried to guard against that more recently.
I also want to ask you, because this is sort of like a high level thinking exercise and not so much like player takes. I mean, we're probably not going to do like an insane amount of player takes anyway in this hour, but do you think that one question that's kind of been in the back of my head, and I'm actually going to be doing, this is spoiler alert, I guess, but for the next episode of the podcast, I'm going to be looking into how rookies have sort of evolved and just if they're still good values, because trends definitely dictate that they, you know, if you're looking at like a decade, 15 years, what have you, rookies have been amazing bets, or are they still great bets? Like, that's basically the question. I haven't even dug into it really. I'm just asking the question, right? But that plays into what I want to ask you here. Do you think and I know that you've tweeted about this a little bit too recently and wrote about it a little bit, but do you think that the fantasy football market right now has gotten smarter? And I say that without specifically talking best ball or specifically talking season long. I think that we got to kind of separate it a little bit, because I do think that there is sharper drafting more than likely, because there's more money on the line and people are thinking about it a little bit more deeply with best ball. But do you think that the market's just gotten smarter with fantasy football, or is that an overblown aspect?
100% it has. I mean, there's just so much more content available from really sharp people that's getting accessed. I mean, I think you think back, I mean, for years, people were playing fantasy football in complete silos, right? There was no one doing podcasts. There was no one doing shows. It was like a magazine would come out on August 28th, and that would be the only fantasy football content people would see for an entire year. And then they would do their draft with their buddies, and they would read out the score from the box score and put it in a logbook. And I mean, then, you get the advent of some of that content, and a lot of that's very basic. But I mean, you look in the last 5-10 years, and I mean, I'm living proof of this, that there's so many people that, realize how limited the barriers of entry were into the content game because of things like, well, Twitter, YouTube, Substack, etc. You don't need to wait for Yahoo or ESPN to tap you on the shoulder anymore to start creating things. And when you have so many more content creators, you have so many more sources of people to provide information. You have people that are asking interesting questions and inspiring other people to ask other interesting questions. And I think we just have so much higher level of information available to players now that players then in turn are making a lot better decisions in terms of what they're listening to, in terms of how they're actionalizing that. So yeah, I think for sure the fantasy football market has gotten a lot smarter, and it's happening in all formats. The average conversation I have in a trade with a dynasty manager is like a much higher level conversation that I would have had 6 years ago. You look at seasonal ADP, and yeah, I agree. You're going to have, I think, still a much softer ADP in your 12-person work league than you will in Best Ball Mania or in the main event. But I still think it's probably a lot sharper relative to where it would have been years and years ago. Yeah. And in part because a lot of those people that are playing in those 12-person work leagues are now playing in Best Ball Mania. Similar. I've been looking at a pretty similar research angle, and I was writing about recently. It was sort of where do these spike weeks come from, and over the last 3 years, one of the things I noticed was like, well, there's a good chunk of these late round spike weeks coming from the wide receiver position. And I'm like, almost all of these are rookies. It's like half of the spike weeks within a 3-year period of wide receivers going after wide receiver 60 were all from rookies. And then it's like, you look at the board and it's like, I don't even know if this data actually is useful in this respect, because, Garrett Wilson comes out in 2022. He was being drafted as the wide receiver 59. And it's like, we would never do that now. Like, that would just never happen in a million years. So it's really hard to figure out, like, clearly there's a point at which rookies are overpriced, right? Like, if we just drafted them all in the first round, that would be bad. So it's like, so trying to figure out where that is, it's tough. Like, it feels like every year since we've started being smarter with it, people say this is the year that they're overpriced. I mean, it was demonstrably not true last year, right? Like, Marvin and Rome were bad picks, but like, you look on net, like Brian Thomas, Lab McConkey, Bucky Irving, Jaden Daniels,
Neighbors.
Like, there was a lot of the rookies last year were a lot of the best picks in fantasy. So, that's just one sample of outcomes, but I think they are still an intriguing bet this year. But I definitely agree that if it continues in this direction at some point in time, they might become overpriced.
Yeah, and this has also been something on my mind when it comes to the running back dead zone. Like, part of it is, I think, you mentioned like the inundation of content and just the fact that like there's just stuff everywhere and it's really easy for things to, it's like a game of telephone in a way, right? Where you're hearing one thing and then you're kind of interpreting it like to a 95% accuracy each time. And then it gets kind of watered down and confusing in a way. And I think it's gotten, like, my opinion is it's kind of gotten to that point with the running back dead zone. And I think it kind of got to that point last year a little bit. I wrote an email about how like the dead zone wasn't really the dead zone last year in the same exact way that we had seen. That actually did come to fruition to a degree, but that's not really the point. The point to me is that like when we come up with these general ideas of draft strategy and game theory, and those things then get, I mean, look at how Siegel wrote Zero RB and what he wrote about in that article and how people talk about Zero RB today and how they've talked about it for years at this point. But like Zero RB is not just to do this one thing and always do this one thing. Same thing with late round quarterback back in the day whenever I wrote that ebook. Like, I didn't write that to say that you have to draft quarterbacks late all the time. I'm saying this is what the market is giving us, and this is what generally happens in the market from a trends perspective. And so with the running back dead zone, I think that it's gotten to the point where it's just oversimplified. And I think this plays into what we were just talking about with the market getting smarter. And is it possible that we're in an era right now where the dead zone just is no more because the market is not boosting up the same type of Mike Davis archetypes that they've been boosting up in the past? And like, like Zamir Whites of the world happen, sure. But at the same time, it seems like it's not happening as frequently. Do you seem to see the same type of thing in the data that you look at?
For sure. This running back dead zone conversation, and I wrote about it a bit last year too, and it brings to mind Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. So, what I mean by that is like, there's a reason why rounds 3 to 6 used to be a bad range to draft running backs. And it's not because there's like a pit of molten lava that all running backs fall into as soon as they hit round 3. Without knowing, under the veil of ignorance, we had developed certain habits about what running backs went there. And that tended to be where poor running back profiles started to cluster. And then, we started talking about it far more. And people, like you said, take sort of the very two-dimensional version of that content, which is, okay, rounds 3 to 6, no running backs, got it. And because of that, we just start drafting way less running backs there. The running backs that used to go around 3 start going around 5. Round 5 starts going around 7, etc. And those running backs, of course, just become much less troubling picks when you start pushing their ADP back. I looked at, like I said, this piece about sort of where results come from in drafts that came out last week. Specifically, it was looking at running back versus receiver and how much, sort of wide receiver prices have increased over the years, and even how they've mostly stayed steady since last year when running backs had a really successful year. And if you look at it on a projection versus projection basis, there's just no question right now that like that old dead zone areas where running backs actually start to separate from wide receivers in half PPR. This is best ball mania ADP. They're projecting for more points basically throughout the dead zone. But then you look historically over the last 3 years, and I looked at weeks 10 through 17. So trying to capture for some of the environmental factors that would be present in the playoffs, and 20 plus point weeks and 25 plus point weeks. And wide receivers are just like kicking the shit out of running backs in that in that round 3 through 6 range. So to me, this sort of shows two things. I mean, one, projection, of course, as we've known about the dead zone, does not really capture the whole story in terms of making our running back versus wide receiver decisions in that range. But two, that like we have either intentionally or intuitively like correctly made the decision of where and when to de-emphasize the running back position in that range. And we've correctly decided, okay, we're going to de-weight projection in this area of the draft. We're going to take the wide receivers because we understand they have more upside. The running backs have this fragile floor, and some of these profiles have limited ceiling. And when we've already kind of adjusted for that, this now changes the price calculation, and it makes these running backs far less damaging picks. You look at who I used to think would be the dead zone profiles, and it's now kind of going almost more like the round 7, round 8. I think of that cluster of running backs where it's like basically once the last of those rookie starters are off the board, and you get into the group of like Aaron Jones and Tony Pollard and Brian Robinson, and DeAndre Swift and Isaiah Pacheco. It's like those guys to me are like classic dead zone profiles who 5 years ago would have been going in like round 4 and 5 and would be like screaming avoids that I would never even consider drafting. And I'm not actually that in on many of them, but it's like you look at now and it's like, well, those guys are going round 7, round 8. It's a completely different equation. If they just, because I don't think they have that much upside, but like the upside is they kind of just hang on to the job and survive for an entire season. But if you do that in round 8, that's a rock solid pick. If you just hang on and survive, the wide receivers you're going against are like Emeka Egbuka and Josh Downs and Darnell Mooney. It's not Ted McMillan and Zay Flowers and George Pickens and whoever. So it's just a completely different equation.
Yeah, what's interesting is when I do ADP analysis, because honestly, I probably do more of like the ADP analysis than almost anyone in the space, just because I'm really interested in it. And when I do that, I get a lot of feedback. Like, for instance, I did the tight end dead zone episode earlier this week, which even on the episode, I'm like, I'm not trying to dub this the actual tight end dead zone. It was just a really easy shorthand way to make a title for an episode, right? Yeah. But I got a response, and I got multiple responses from people that said, well, this year is not the same thing as historical years, so like looking at historical ADP data is not necessarily going to help you in the current season because that might not be predictive because the market changes and player archetypes change and the landscape changes. I don't even fully disagree with that notion. Like I look at the running back, like last year in the draft guide in particular, I started to look at, instead of rounds, I started to look at just within positional ranks, right? Yeah. And if you look historically within positional ranks at running back, there is generally a drop off in production after like RB12 and then another big drop off after like RB18 or so, right? So it's like, if we're seeing those drop-offs, then you don't want to be the person drafting at the top of that drop-off. You want to be the one drafting at the bottom of it, similar that you don't want to draft a player at the top of a tier. You want to draft them at the bottom of a tier. And so I feel that with the running back dead zone or even the tight end dead zone, whatever, these areas of drafts where we see bad hit rates or a drop-off in hit rate happen, what I think we need to wrap our head around and be okay with is that year to year, yes, the landscape can change. It's just probably not going to change as dramatically as you think it will change. If you look at last year, we had just a good amount of depth at running back, right? Like it was a solid group overall where there was a bad draft class. There wasn't a lot of competition trying to eat into some of those running backs' workloads. And then we saw a lack of injury, and all of that just hit a perfect storm for running backs to do, especially RB2s, to do really, really well, right? And then this year, I still think it's pretty deep. Like, I think running back is deeper. When you look at this year,
we just added like 6 great rookies who are potentially going to start. Right. Yeah.
So it's deeper, and we feel better about those players. And it's okay to say that even within the position, that might push the hit rates, the drop in hit rate back more, right? And I think that like, because like going back to like the logic of what the dead zone is to me with like running back or even tight end, but with running back in particular, it's always been to me a supply and demand thing. There are only so many elite running backs in football to begin with that are going to be true bell cows in fantasy football, right? And at the end of the year, we still only see a handful of them. So eventually, when you're in round 3 into round 4, you're in RB2 territory, people are like, oh crap, I got to get one of these guys or try to get one of these guys. But realistically, those players are inferior talents. They're not as strong and they just project well, right? At the end of the day, like Zamir White last year, right? And so that's why the dead zone has sort of existed. And to take that to the tight end stuff, and I guess I'll throw this your way too. I think that we see it more at tight end more consistently because of the way tight ends are and the way that they score points, right? Tight ends, we know there's going to be an unbelievable amount of variance week over week at tight end, because a tight end could get 3 catches for 40 yards and a touchdown and be a tight end 1 in a given week, right? And so we know going into a season, especially this year, it's more clear cut than last year, but we go into a season where like, okay, there's only going to be like 3 or 4 tight ends that we know for sure will get a 20% plus target share. Like that we feel very, very confident that happening. Maybe 1 or 2 in the later rounds will emerge and be one of those players. But to me, the reason why the tight end dead zone is actually more stable than the running back dead zone is the fact that there likely is not going to be a scenario in the recent future of tight ends, of us getting like 12 or 13 or 14 tight ends seeing 25% target shares in their offenses, you know? And so like as a result of that, there's just mass variance with those guys that are ranked like tight end 5 to tight end 18, 19. Like it's just what happens every year. And there hasn't been any correlation between tight end 7 to tight end 18 since 2014. Like literally zero correlation between where those guys have been drafted and how many points they've scored. And I think it comes down to those two factors. It's the fact that we only have so many elite tight ends, and I don't know if that's going to change. And then we also see that really like truncated scoring. Like it's just, there's a lot of variance there. Is that the way that you kind of would view it too?
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. And this is like maybe an offshoot of that point. This relates back to what I was saying about sort of the projection brain that we have a lot right now with Best Ball Mania that I think is interesting, but somewhat misguided, where I'm seeing a lot of this year. Look, the later tight ends are priced down really cheap and actually they project better than some of the late running backs and wide receivers. So, you can't draft the early tight ends. You got to wait on some of the tight ends. The really late tight ends, I actually don't mind, but I'm also seeing this constantly brought up for guys that are in the mid to late tight end 1 range. And I think that to me, it reminds me a lot of the arguments that used to be made for, in my view, shaky running back profiles in the running back dead zone, where it's like, well, they project better, they're more stable. And it's like, to me, yeah, if the wide receivers that you find yourself like really interested in drafting in the mid to late rounds are like Christian Kirk and Romeo Doubs and Josh Palmer, I do feel like you might as well just kind of take a tight end. But like, I feel like, the reason, what we're hoping to get out of running backs, wide receivers in that range is just a wider band. I mean, part of this is just like very logical. Like wide receivers are like athletic, fast people who like can do things on the field that a tight end who's being drafted tight end 12 simply is not capable of. It's like, they're probably a dad runner.
Right.
And so like, whatever Kyle Williams' ceiling is this year, I mean, he might score 0 points. Who knows? But like, his ceiling is just more interesting than what you're going to get from the average tight end in that range. So it's not surprising to me that like, all the running backs, wide receivers who project well are gone before we're taking a bunch of like mid tight ends. But there still is some upside potential there from a season long sustained perspective that goes beyond, I hope they score a touchdown in week 17. And I feel like what gets underrated is when you're, especially again, in like a best ball format or in the main event, maybe less so in your redraft league, if you're trying to finish first in this like massive entry tournament, like I'm very uncomfortable about, I don't think these builds are horrible or bad or anything. They can totally work. But like, you have to acknowledge that there's an opportunity cost, not just with projection, but there's an opportunity cost when you're devoting 3 spots in your lineup to players that like don't realistically have all that much sustained season long upside, where you're just kind of hoping to ham and egg some touchdowns together. And so that has an opportunity cost too, right? Whereas if you can draft one of the few tight ends early where that does not apply, and then also just keep stacking upside bets throughout your draft, that's quite attractive to me, even if it projects slightly worse at base. And I think that sometimes when we start to see the projections, we get very anchored to that. And yeah, it reminds me a lot of the running back dead zone when we talk about that tight end range for sure. I do think it's a little bit more stable. Yeah.
And the projections piece is something that I've kind of railed against for like a decade at this point, where projections are great. Projections are fine. And people can look and should be viewing projections. And if you want to build projections, I think the exercise of building projections is very, very helpful. Like I do it every single year, but I get people, and I got an email this morning from someone that was like, hey, I really want to join your Patreon. Do you publish projections? And my answer to that is no. And the reason for that is, number one, the people who do it really well are doing it a lot and they are on top of it constantly and they are tweaking things constantly. And I don't have the time to do that at the moment. And I don't really think that you necessarily need to unless you have a certain sole purpose for it. Like there's definitely more purpose in it for like DFS purposes or something like that, right? And I'm not a DFS guy. That's one reason. But also I think that projections don't tell you nearly enough about range of outcomes at the end of the day, right? And you're talking about like, a Kyle Williams or some rookie wide receiver that's going to go late versus a projectable tight end. And people get really, really excited about the projectable tight end as opposed to the range of outcomes of you could look at Bashal Tutin and see that sure, there's a floor that's kind of scary, but the ceiling is crazy, right? Like we inherently know that ambiguous backfield, really fun prospect, has the right traits, all of that kind of stuff. Good offense, or at least should be a good offensive environment. Like there's reason to love Bashal Tutin, and people are not going to love Bashal Tutin because he's going to project in a split backfield, and people are going to say, oh, I'm just going to go with the sure thing at tight end and get a player that I feel more confident in at that position than get a Bashal Tutin type. Like I could sit here today right now and easily make an argument to take Bashal Tutin over Travis Kelce, like all day, like make that argument, right? And I'm not saying I'm going to rank it that way per se, but I'm just saying like that is where I have that like projectable group of tight ends is more in that range where there are those really high upside and fun rookies or like, the uncertainty of some really talented players. And the player that I've always gone back with this example through the years at tight end is Greg Olsen. Greg Olsen used to, back in the day, get drafted in like round 5. I'm looking at my ADP database. I was actually pulling it up as you were talking because it hit me that this is exactly what we're talking about. If you look at where he was drafted, 2018, 57th overall, 2017, 51st, 2016, 48th, like in that, like, 5th to 7th round range usually. And if you look at how he performed against ADP expectation, 1.8 points over expected, 0.7 points over expected, minus 2.9 points over expected. Like that's per game, 0.7 points over expected. That kind of player is not winning you your league. You're just getting by with that kind of player. And that's not even factoring an opportunity cost, where at that time, there were a lot of good running backs and wide receivers emerging from that 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round range that could be really winning you, the more important position. So like at the end of the day, I think that what you brought up with like the projectable output of some of these tight ends, you can still have your favorites. Like it's fine if you like, I'm still okay enough. And at most of the time, and I think his price has gotten a little bit higher, but like Evan Ingram is still intriguing to me in some way because, there's the Joker role and there's a lack of competition in that offense. And there's like, someone like Travis Kelce, I'm just like, I can't do this.
Doing it for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Like this is all based on projection and not looking at what that true ceiling might look like for a 36-year-old tight end coming off his by far worst season of his career, And so that's where I think that's where like the tight end dead zone comes from and why I think a lot of those guys end up being overrated at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I wrote this in a piece last year, but like when we're talking tournaments, you just log into draft 680,000 entries or something like that. It's like your median expectation is to finish like 340,000th place, right? So it's like you have 18 chances to change that. You have 18 chances to go from, outside of the top 300,000 to first. And I get it's not that linear. It's a weekly advance and everything, but like you need to hit a few massive season-long sustained hits to be able to probably accomplish that. And I do try to not take lightly the value of each individual chance to do that, and to try to avoid, when possible, making a pick that I think is only going to be, that temporary life raft, right? That's just going to get me by at the position. And if you can't picture a scenario where your pick is, the best pick you could make that round more than 1 or 2 times in a draft, then I do think you are being a little bit too safe. So that's certainly, I'm largely in agreement with that for sure.
And to put a bow on this, I'm going to say that this era's Greg Olsen is TJ Hockenson.
Yeah, it's true. He's always there.
It's the same thing. And I'm looking at Hockenson versus expectation, minus 0.4 points per game, plus 2.1, plus 3.6 whenever he had that like crazy, he was just getting targeted like crazy. And that was also an overall ADP of 120, I guess. So it wasn't that season. But regardless, like when he's been drafted, in the Greg Olsen range, which I guess has only happened twice at this point. He exceeded expectation by 2 points and by 0.2 points. That's not going to win you your league at the end of the day. Like, he'll have stretches, that's fine. But I feel the same way. Like, I think that he's the quintessential, this year especially, like the quintessential Greg Olsen type pick. You know, fine. I'm not going to like yell at you for taking TJ Hockenson, but at the same time, it's really hard for me personally to just be overly excited about that when 5 rounds later, 6 rounds later, you're going to get just as much upside from that kind of player.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. I want to ask you also if you think zero RB is now dead after last year.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I used to draft a lot of zero RB teams. I've drafted very few this year. So maybe I think it's dead. I don't think that any of these things are dead because I try not to take these things too literally.
Yeah.
You know,
it's good.
To bring mindset back to the good heart's law of it. To me, zero RB is more about a set of principles, and it's more about being aware that wide receiver scoring is more dictated by talent relative to running back, and running back scoring can, at times at least, be dictated in contingent ways and based on circumstantial ways, and understanding how that affects the ultimate ceiling of our roster construction. And then also being very mindful, to me, not to just never take running back bets, but it's more about being choosy about the running back bets that we want to take. Because I think if you approach, especially tournaments, from the standpoint of, I'm trying to hit an extremely high percentile outcome, I know that it is possible to, in the late season, have teams that project similarly to a lot of early running back teams at the running back position with contingent upside bets or with late breakout running backs, because we see those every single year. And so if I'm going to take a running back in the early rounds, I want to take a running back who has a realistic path to outproduce, you know, that contingent layer. Like, if you think of like a Tyrone Tracy last year, to me, he was like a great example of like what happens when you just kind of like are a starting running back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, that's just sort of like what starting running backs score. And like, you can get a guy who projects that way by week 11, especially in redraft, just from contingent scenarios most years. So it's like, I want a guy who can break past that threshold by a significant degree if I'm going to invest in an early running back pick in it. But there's a lot of opportunities to do that. You know, I still think we have not been like the one area where I think the market has maybe not adjusted quite well enough to the dead zone. We have, but like, not only are we just drafting all sort of the dead zone-ish profile running backs later, but we also are drafting quite some very exciting running backs later. You know, like Marion Hampton's a first round pick going at like the 4 or 5 turn for now. Maybe not. He doesn't have an eyeball, and then he'll be going in the first. Right. But we'll see. I mean, Trevion is going in the 6th, and he was like a very well regarded pass catching prospect who was a top 40 pick. He's going like the middle of the 6th round. Judkins, the top 40 pick, who I wasn't actually as high on as Trevion or Hampton, but like, he's a top 40 pick who's had an ability to handle a workload, is super athletic. And he's going in the 7th, which is like crazy. I don't think we would have ever done that a while ago. It hasn't been distributed evenly. And so because there's more interesting running back bets and more interesting prices, I'm tending to draft a lot of them. That being said, I think these things always come back around. You know, there was a lot of thought about, is late round quarterback dead?
Right.
You know, a few years ago. And to me, late round quarterback's very back this year. I think just the profiles that are going in that range are very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And so I suspect that zero RB will be back with a vengeance in the future. But I think it's less about, you know, the specific adherence to, well, I'm drafting my first running back in round 7 or something like that. And it's more about keeping in mind a set of principles that in certain ADP environments, certain NFL environments might lead you to not taking any running backs for the first 5 or 6 rounds in a lot of your drafts. And sometimes that doesn't manifest that way. I don't think it's manifesting that way this year, to where I'm drafting a lot of zero RB teams, but I suspect that the arc of the universe is complicated, and we'll have it back in our lives again at some point.
Yeah. And I still think there are certain archetypes that we should be going after and not going after. Like, you know, I know that we could argue that to what we talked about earlier, that like archetype drafting isn't as relevant these days because the market has gotten sharper, but there's still going to be pockets where, there are like for instance, Jared Goff at the beginning of the offseason when his ADP was way higher than it should have been, or even Baker now.
I don't know. I don't know what we're doing with Baker. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Where it's like, okay, we have a lot of data that shows that, high touchdown rates one year, really bad bets to make the following year, and, so on and so forth. And then we have the same kind of arguments about like pass catching at running back, right? Like you want pass catching running backs. If there is a red flag to a running back's profile from a pass catching standpoint, and you're getting them in the first 3 or 4 rounds, like that's a red flag that you might not want to go in that direction and, at least not be overweight on that player. And so I do think that like that's really important too, as we like look at what the dead zone is all about, because, at the end of the day, like I said, I think that we're in an area of time right now and an era of time where we have really talented running backs across the league that are capable of being bell cow type backs. I mean, Breece Hall is like a mid-range RB2 right now, like Breece Hall's talented AF. Like the dude is clearly very, very good. Obviously had a down year last year, and that's going to impact the way that people are going to view him. But we know that he has a 3-down skill set. We have concrete evidence of this, right? And even like Chase Brown, like there's some concern about the fact that, he was a late round pick and yada, yada, yada. And, what was his workload stemming from last year, stemming from, a lack of competition. And that's all scary, right? But if you are looking at this from mostly an upside perspective, you can still use Chase Brown as an anchor, right? There's a lot of players that are out there that should make us feel pretty strong about, not necessarily needing to force 0 RB. And that's where I think there's this intersection of strategy and player analysis, where a lot of people will just look at the player analysis side and just say like, yeah, draft this guy, don't draft this guy. And then others will, and people probably put me in this other bucket where they think that I am not, player analysis focused enough, and that I'm only looking at the strategy side, and that, I think that you can't draft running backs in the, between round 3 and 6 because of the dead zone. That's not it at all. I think there's just an intersection of all of this where we have to just look at what the trends say, understand what the trends say, and then look at the player analysis side and kind of go from there.
Chase Brown is a fascinating player this year to me.
I agree.
Because he is, to me, he's the poster child of how we've changed mostly in a good way and maybe too much. Because like, I feel so confident that in like 2021, this guy's going at like the 1.9 and I'm like hard avoid, like he reminds me a lot of like, remember when we drafted Kenyon Drake at like the 111 one year?
Yes. 100%. Yeah.
And it was like, here's this guy who like was a workhorse back for like a sustained period of time at the end of the season. And he was like as good as any other running back in fantasy for a while, but we're reasonably less sure that he's actually that guy compared to some other dudes. And at that time we were like, but we actually don't care. We're going all gas, no brakes. What's his projection? Put him right up there.
Right.
Is there like systemic risk here? Not worried about it. 110. We're drafting him ahead of Michael Thomas. And with Chase Brown though, it's like we've corrected to a massive degree. He's going in like the middle of round 3. And
which is a huge difference in value. A huge difference in value. I know that people are going to hear that and they'll be like, "Oh, it's only a round and a half." Like that is a huge difference in value.
And it's actually almost like double the gap if you think about the fact that like, if you think about how many running backs we used to draft early. And so if you think about it in terms of the wide receiver opportunity cost.
Yeah.
The wide receiver opportunity cost of a late first used to be probably like the second wide receiver drafted. Right. But now we're drafting, not only are we ranking Chase Brown, I think behind running backs he would have been drafted ahead of years ago, like a Bucky Irving, for instance. But like, because a large reason he's being pushed down is because so many other wide receivers are being drafted earlier. He's going against like, JSN or whatever, who I think
Marvin
is wide
Harrison,
receiver 18.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's like, not only is he going in the mid third instead of the late first, but if you think about like where the wide receiver 18 would have been drafted in the era that Chase Brown would have been a late first, it would have been like the 5th round.
Yes.
So it's like just a completely different world that we're living in, to the point where now that projection, instead of being fully baked into his cost, it's like his price is now kind of a reasonable hedge between like, if he just is what he was last year, he's like one of the best picks on the entire board. And there is still, I think, a lot of fragility to his profile. but he's priced now somewhere in the middle of that, where, there's a lot of room to surpass his price on either side. And I've mostly been into it. I've also made the case, and this is where he gets into like the player take aspect of it, where it's like, yeah, like I get the fragility because he doesn't have a big pedigree. He was fine last year, but he wasn't, winning like world's most efficient running back contests. But like, this is a guy at least who has a history of handling a massive volume of work in college. Yeah. And that matters to me a lot because, that shows to me he's not just like some guy who kind of fell into volume that can't handle it. Like he actually can. He's shown that he can in college. That's strongly predictive. Is he going to be, as good in that volume role as Bijan Robinson? Probably not. But like, if the Bengals decide this year, hey, works for us if we have like the 15th best running back and we can just load him up with touches and he can do everything for us. And hey, our offense is really going to be, built by T. Higgins and Jamar Chase being the difference makers anyways. That works for me. So he's like a fascinating player to me this year.
Yeah, I mean, your point about the wide receiver opportunity cost is spot on because, like, here's the thing. We know that if you hit on a top 3 running back in fantasy football, that's the biggest advantage you're going to have in pretty much any format, right? Like, if you have that, I mean, look at what Jahmyr Gibbs did down the stretch last year, right? Like, if you have that kind of production and what CMC did a couple of years ago, you're in such a good spot to win your fantasy league if you just get that guy, right? Mm-hmm. And it's different when, and by the way, Kenyon Drake in college was not what Chase Brown was. That's a good, so it's another good example of why Drake, I know where it's weird talking about a pick from like 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, or however long it was, but Chase Brown does have that backbone. But the opportunity cost side, if you're saying to yourself, okay, we're going to draft either Chase Brown or Marvin Harrison Jr. right here, right? And you're asking a question of which player is the overall better value, and you look at the range of outcomes. What if Marvin Harrison Jr. still has a chance to not really improve and just be, what he was to a degree last year? We also recognize that he was a really good prospect and that things could improve and they could deploy him differently and run him down the middle of the field a little bit more and give him better looks. And hopefully, let's cross our fingers that happens. But we also have to recognize that, like, if the 90th percentile outcome hits for Chase Brown or Marvin Harrison Jr., I think we'd all agree we'd rather have Chase Brown in that environment, certainly. Right? So that's why I think, like, to your point, this is way different than drafting him over Nico Collins, where we know that we're going to get some beefy production from Nico. We don't know that with the wide receivers that we're drafting him over right now.
I mean, the argument used to be when Zero RB first was on the scene, the argument was more about rejecting scarcity and embracing production, right? The argument was wide receivers are going to outscore these running backs because of how we used to draft. Yeah. And don't be scared of the running back scarcity argument. Just take the better players who are going to score more points, because there's ways to combat the scarcity issue later with contingent value, arbitrage through pass catching running backs, taking shots on late rookie breakouts, all of that thing, right? Now, that's no longer the case because we're drafting, I think, much smarter. Running backs are out projecting the wide receivers. So it's not like you have to draft running backs because of a scarcity problem. If anything, it's actually the opposite. The arguments now that you hear, which I think have some merit for drafting early wide receivers, is like, look, we're drafting these wide receivers like hotcakes. You're going to run out of upside eventually. So you've got to make sure you have enough wide receiver firepower before you turn over to running back, because look what kind of volume you can get later. I think they're both reasonable arguments, but they're completely different arguments. And to me, this second argument, it lends itself more to diminishing returns, right? And one of the things that I've kind of come to the conclusion of, it's like, yes, I do still agree that we shouldn't be probably in most years drafting like these crazy running back ×4 starts or things like that, right? We still want that upside at the wide receiver position. One of the taglines of Zero RB always used to be win the flex. And that made a lot of sense because wide receivers, when you looked at that flex range, because of the way we were drafting, were consistently outscoring running backs to the flex. That's just like demonstrably not the case anymore, especially in half PPR and underdog, where you're you should probably be orienting to put a running back into your flex position. So to me now, it's kind of an inverted zero RB argument where you're looking at, okay, I know where my wide receiver upside is coming from. There's less contingent value here. I need to make sure I get sufficient wide receiver upside early, but I don't want to get into a range where I'm taking on diminishing returns at a position that doesn't project to have quite the same season-long upside or scoring. So once I've got my efficient, firepower in my wide receiver position, I want to make sure that I'm actually adding in some running backs here to capture that value. And so that the result of that for me is that I'm drafting, I guess, more boring teams than I usually have. I'm just kind of building out my starting lineup like a boomer a lot of the time.
It's funny. It's like it's the parabola meme at the end of the day. Like,
exactly.
We're basically just back to how those boomers were drafting. So speaking about running backs, I already mentioned Bashal Tutin, but you wrote a piece about about ambiguity and the Jags backfield. I know that you went at it on Twitter a bit with folks who were just rejecting your ideas and your notion here, but you believe Bashal Tutin is the best click in that backfield. Do you still believe that, number one? But also, what makes you feel so confident about this? Like talk to me about the logic behind all of this.
Well, first of all, it's like feeling really confident in something. And I tried to explain this in the piece. Like feeling very confident that something is the right take is like very different than feeling very confident that something's going to happen. To me.
I agree. Yes. Yeah.
My attitude about this in particular, and most of what I wrote about in the piece is like, I just completely disagree with the notion that if I'm like 60% sure of a take, that means I should enact that take 60% of the time. Like, to me, I disagree with that. I think like there's nothing you can be 100% sure of in fantasy football. Yeah. But like, if you think that something is a materially better bet, even if you can totally see scenarios where it doesn't work out, like, I think you want to still enact that bet as much as possible, especially in a tournament setting when we're going to lose like 122 of our entries, in the first 15 weeks. Because if I think something is a strong bet to make it cost, I want to give myself as many chances as possible of rolling the dice correctly around that bet for a team that might actually advance. There's how many times have you had a strong stand on a player and then it doesn't amount to anything because you only drafted that player on so many teams because you didn't want to get ahead of yourself. And then you never got that player matched up with some other player that you were really
the right
correct
guy.
about.
Yeah.
So, I'm willing to take stands without, there's a difference, I think, between like having conviction and being like arrogant or overconfident. And I want to have conviction, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I can't think of a scenario in which my take doesn't hit. With that preface out of the way, I just think Tutin is a really, really intriguing prospect who was one of the best. If you look through a lot of what I do in my running back work prior to the draft is one, it's the tape, but it's also looking at advanced running back efficiency metrics, looking at missed tackles forced, looking at breakaway percentage, looking at yards after contact. And any of these metrics that you start sorting by, you get basically the consensus best running backs in the class. And then you consistently get RJ Harvey and Bashal Tutin. And then the NFL decided that actually the nerds were right about RJ Harvey. They drafted him in round 2, despite anyone not expecting that. But Tutin still goes about where he was expected to go. And I do think he was a legitimately undervalued piece by the NFL. But he goes to an incredible situation. Travis Etienne, to me, is an interesting player who I actually thought was kind of undervalued by the community for a while as a real-life running back, where I thought he got nitpicked kind of unfairly, especially as a pass catcher. But you look at how, fantasy football generally waits to the end of the season, but especially in Best Ball Mania and especially in the main event or these late season contests, we now have 3 straight years of him declining in efficiency throughout the year as he starts to get banged up and declining in efficiency year over year over year. And so I just look at a player where I have serious concerns that I'm drafting a player who's going to be at his best in the weeks that I need him most. When I look at a player who's gotten less efficient for 3 consecutive years, and within those years gotten less efficient from week 1 through week 17. And with Bigsby, I've been drafting more of him because he's been falling a lot. I don't totally know why, even though we've had like a lot of sort of negative news about Tutin and negative news about Etienne. But so I'm drafting him way more now at his new cost. But earlier, at least, my view was, I think he is better than Etienne at a couple of things, but he's just such a one-dimensional player. And this is like just like kind of a feel thing. But like when I look at how Liam Cohen operated his offense last year, even dating back to how he operated his offense at Kentucky, it's like a very pace and space style of offense. And I just don't know how much I can picture like a Tank Bigsby fitting in a offense that's kind of built around versatility, because he's just kind of a sledgehammer. So I just don't know if there's a role for him. That being said, I think the cost now is quite limited, and maybe Tootin, is just not ready this year, not good, whatever. It's 4th round rookie, and Etienne kind of looks like he did last year, and maybe Cohen says, well, look, I only have one running back that can get me any yards, and so I'm gonna rebuild sort of a little bit of what I wanted to do, and maybe Tank hits. But with Tootin, I just think it's the best of all worlds. I'm reasonably confident that he's a legitimately good rusher if he gets an opportunity. I think he has some receiving upside. It's not an elite receiving profile by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not like a hopeless one. And it's an offense that I'm extremely excited about, basically every piece in. And I just look at him as one of the last opportunities to get a potential lead running back over the second half of the season that could potentially be a lead in all circumstances, and has a lot of really intriguing aspects to his profile. I think he's really good, but we'll find out.
Yeah, no, I love that answer. I mean, I've been a Tootin guy even before the combine. He popped with the stuff that I look at, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I do worry about the profile, like you said. Like, it might, not to say that I would approach it this way, because I'm still going to draft him in season long, but it might be a better best ball kind of selection from the perspective of like it hitting at the right time, and how antsy a home league situation might get, because you only have so many spots in your bench and stuff, and you don't want to be the person that drops Bashal Tootin, and then he ends up going off, week 11 onward. But even still, I'm drafting him everywhere. He's someone that I'm really into. And obviously, it's an ambiguous backfield situation. I want to ask you one more question before we go. I asked this to Daigle a couple weeks ago, and I think it's just an interesting one. So if you look at the top 30, top 40 wide receivers, it feels like a pretty efficient position in the way that the market is ranking them. Do you feel, number one, do you feel like there are any obvious fades at wide receiver right now, sort of in that range? And then if there aren't many of them, does that speak to the market being sharper, or do you think the position's just deep?
Probably a little bit of both, but I do think the market's gotten a lot sharper. I think the market has always been much better at pricing established wide receivers than they have been at other positions. In large part because once you're at a full route share and you've played like 3 years in the league, your target earning ability tends to be pretty stable until you decline. It's not that hard for the market to correctly rank most of these guys once you look at, okay, well, because like realistically, once you've played a few years in the league, you've gotten up to full routes, and it's like, well, you're a 25% target share guy. And you kind of like are a 25% target share guy until you're not good anymore. And so most of the big divergences, are either due to like injury, but beyond that, it's rookies, second year players, or it's players, that are changing teams, changing quarterbacks. So I think we've always been pretty efficient with the established wide receivers. We used to just be like horrific at understanding rookie upside at the wide receiver position. Yeah. Where it used to just be like, you could basically just do it blind. Like if you just didn't even look at any of the profiles, and you just like, every time you saw a rookie, you just click them in, 25% of your drafts, you're probably coming out ahead basically every single year. But we've now gotten a lot better with that. And so now that we've done a better job of pricing in the rookies, it's hard to find that much of an edge left within the wide receiver position. There's like a couple of fades, but there's not a lot that are obvious to me. Like, to me, the most obvious fade at the wide receiver position is probably Terry McLaurin. Mm-hmm. And that's just like the one thing that I don't think the fantasy industry will ever get past, is like when we have a player who's been the same player for years, but one year that same player scores twice as many touchdowns. We just decide they're like actually twice as good as they've ever been. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like the Baker Mayfield thing as well, where it's like that, I think, is just probably the one fade that will continually pay dividends, is if you just kind of always fade the veteran who scored way more touchdowns than they've ever scored before, and then they will probably ever score again. You're probably coming out ahead more often than not. So he stands out to me as a fade. But beyond that, most of my fades are not comfortable ones. Like they're ones where it's like, I believe in having stands on things, and I have smaller preferences. So, it's like I barely drafted any of Amon-Ra St. Brown this year, and most of that is just because I really like the other guys like Nico Collins and Brian Thomas quite a lot, and I like them a little bit more. And I'm looking, okay, well, how can I get more than 8% to everybody? And it's like, well, if I'm going to get 12% Nico and 12% Brian Thomas, Amon-Ra's got to go to the wayside. But I would never be like, Amon-Ra's a bad pick, you know, at the 111 or whatever. It's like, obviously he's a totally fine pick at the 111. He's a great player. So I agree. The fades are made difficult. Like the other guys that I think have potential to be very bad clicks are, you know, just sort of some of the riskier picks. Like I think Marvin Harrison carries a ton of risk at his tag, given what he did at his rookie year. I think Tyreek Hill at his escalating tag carries a ton of risk, given he wasn't very good last year. But you also look at those profiles, and it's very easy to conceive of how they can beat me. You know, it used to be what I try to look for in fades are like small hit, big miss players where I'm not that afraid of them ruining my season if they hit.
Right. Exactly.
And I see paths for large downside. And I don't see a lot of those this year. So to me, now what I wind up fading is I'm either fading players that I think are just like slightly mispriced because of like silly things like, oh, they scored a few too many touchdowns last year. They're being priced off too much. Or players that I think are just sort of, you know, maybe small miss and small hit, but they're in a range where I think there's bigger hit potential right next to them.
That's how I feel too. Because whenever I do the draft guide, I'm putting together my targets and avoids, and with the avoids at wide receiver, and why I've asked you and Daigle is because it's just a little bit more difficult of an exercise to kind of go through. And I think the one player that stands out to me in the I don't think he'll burn me category is Jerry Jeudy. Where
that's a good.
I don't feel like could I see a scenario where he beats ADP? Of course. Right. Like but if you look at some of the splits, you know, with and without Jameis and with Cedric Tillman in the lineup and all that kind of, you start to create this story where you're like, wow, this could just be like a 19% target share guy who is just fine, but not anything special. Meanwhile, you get players in that range where there is still a lot of potential. And like, I think the biggest range of outcome player in that area is probably like a Jawan Jennings, because he goes against every historical thing that we, aside from like previous season production and peripherals, like you're talking about like a year 5 breakout. Like there's literally never been a player like this, at least in my database, where he has a breakout in year 5 like that. And it's that good of a breakout in year 5 like that. Like maybe you could go back to like, this is just off the top.
The only one I can think of is Brandon Lloyd.
Yeah, Brandon Lloyd type, or like maybe Devontae Parker type. Like we kind of saw that happen with him. But I don't think the peripherals were nearly as good, and I don't think the circumstances were nearly as good. So I'm actually like, I'm still in on Jennings, because I like the situation he's in and the upside that he presents. But he's a player where like, it's weird, because I think that people, this is just a perfect example of probably you too, like not drafting off just the median outcome. But like, I like Jennings more than Jeudy, even though I think Jeudy has a more stable base than Jennings does, right?
Totally.
And that's sort of what this comes down to at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Jeudy. I put him on a recent Dynasty show, and it's for a different reason than McLaurin, but it's kind of a similar idea. You look at his targets and yards per route run over the 5 seasons of his career. He goes 0.21, 1.66, 0.21, 1.85, 0.22, 2.18, 0.18, 1.65, 0.20, 1.72. He's basically been the exact same guy his entire career. And there was nothing about last year on a per route basis that was more impressive than his previous 4 seasons. He ran 200 more routes than he's ever run before.
Yep.
So kind of similar to the touchdown thing, it's just a routes version of that, where it's like, yeah, if you take a guy who's been a pretty good wide receiver and then you give him 200 more routes, you know, he'll probably get 40 more catches and 500 more yards and 3 or 4 more touchdowns without really changing who he is. And looking at the Browns this year, you know, maybe they roll the Flacco for 17 games and that happens again. I don't think so. I think probably most of the season winds up being Gabriel or Sanders, and they end up probably running the ball more and being more dysfunctional. And so I agree. I think you're going to see Jerry Jeudy probably earn target on 20 to 21% of his routes and probably have between 1.6 and 1.9 yards per route run. But like if that route total is 500 instead of 700, you know, the production is going to decline by like 28%, which is like really hard for people to wrap their head around. The inverse of the Jeudy case that I've made is the Pickens case, where it's like, this is a guy who I think is about to run 150 more routes than he's ever run before. And if he's just the same guy he's been the last couple of years, he's going to look like a completely different player in people's eyes. Yeah. So I think that's one thing that we do still miss a little bit. It's one thing when we're talking about translating targets per route run and yards per route run from a guy who didn't run all the routes. Because sometimes you can run into like the Kadarius Toney problem of the world, where it's when 30% of the routes that he runs are like, let's throw a screen pass to Kadarius Toney.
Right.
Then he runs 90% of the routes, and you might not like the world you're living in. But when we have these guys who are already full-time players, and it's just a matter of, well, they got a completely new environment, and so now they're running 150 or 200 more or less routes than they have just because of circumstance.
Right.
But they're still the same player. They might still have the same role. That's one of those things where I think the projections and especially our perception of these players can be way off in a big way. Pickens has been one of my most drafted players for that reason.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. I think that's a really, really good way to think about it, is like, if you're not seeing a change in the actual player, I felt this way. This is going back to TJ Hockenson. Whenever he had that crazy season where at the second half of the year, he was getting like insane volume, he was not any different as a player. It was the same dude. Like, it wasn't his yards per out run, his targets per, or his yards per out run numbers, at least, were not dramatically different. It wasn't like he just got insanely good, And so I do think that perspective is one that folks should definitely think about when they're drafting. But Jacob, man, this was awesome. People are going to love it. Let everyone know what you're doing, what you're working on, and where they can find you.
Yeah, I've referenced a couple of the pieces already on the show, but you can find all my written work at Thinking About Thinking, which is just my name, jakobsanderson.substack.com. You can find the piece I've been referencing a lot on where upside comes from based on ADP analysis. If you like JJ's work, you probably enjoy structural ADP analysis. So I think you might enjoy that piece. You can find me every Tuesday night on the Fantasy Points YouTube and podcast network doing Dynasty Points. You can find me on ADP Chasing as well, also every Tuesday morning. And we'll have a lot of fun stuff going on there throughout the summer. We'll have drafts and stuff up on the Ship Chasing feed too.
Yeah, I can't recommend your work more. I love it. I'm always reading the newsletter and stuff. You do great stuff.
Appreciate it.
You can find my guide, my work over on lateround.com. Make sure you are ordering the draft guide right now. I'm also doing live streams all the time now on YouTube with best ball season. Most definitely here for a larger number of people, not just the sickos out there who are drafting in May and June, but doing live streams all the time. I'm giving out free guides pretty frequently on those live streams. So check them out. That's at youtube.com/@lateroundff. Otherwise, everyone, thanks for tuning in.